All right, hey y'all, welcome back. So this lecture, we're going to be talking about chapter 4, the origins of the modern state, to get kind of a feel for where the state came from, right? And so the first thing we'll talk about is section 1, what is the state? And so when most scientists are trying to conceive of what is a state, they usually at least go back to Max Weber. Max Weber was a famous German sociologist. Um, he he wrote a lot about the necessity of the state and the necessity of the bureaucracy in organizing society. And so the different ways that the bureaucracy is vital to a society, to the state, how it should be run, how checks and balances should work, all these sorts of things. So he was a very famous sort of theorist of administrative bureaucracy. Sounds boring, but he was a very insightful and contributory individual to modern society. So his famous book comes out in 1918, and he basically claims that a state is this quote, right? This is what a lot of people quote: a human community that claims a monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force in a particular territory, right? So there's a lot of little pieces there. You have to have a monopoly of force. It has to be legitimate force, right? And you have to have territoriality. Okay. And I would also point out before we go any further that because we're in comparative politics, we need to understand that the word state and the word nation mean different things in political science parlance. A nation and a state are not the same thing. In political science, a state is what we conceptualize as the modern nation state, right? The United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, Mexico, etc., right? A nation, under the terminology of political science, is more of a collective ethnicity, a collective religion. Jews would be a very good example. They're sort of spread out all over the world. They generally have been, at least pre-Israel. And yet they saw themselves as sort of part of one quote unquote nation, right? So that's a different concept than the modern state we were talking about. Uh, and so I would point to a couple of suggestions, right, that have common identity, but don't necessarily have common territoriality. And so Jews who do not live in Israel would be a good suggestion. The Kurds, who can be found sort of mixed between Iraq, Iran, and Syria and Turkey, in all of these four areas called, they like to call it Kurdistan, but they are territorially differentiated between those four nation states. You also have the Roma, or what we would sort of pejoratively call gypsies in the European system. And then I would also point to the Tamils, right? So they occupy sort of southwestern India, but also Sri Lanka, Burma, and some other states around there. And in Sri Lanka, actually, they exterminated every last Tamil in the nation. That was about 6 years ago. There was a genocide. And so the Tamils mostly have had to leave Sri Lanka, of course, and have ended up in diasporas in India, Myanmar, etc. Okay. I would also mention that monopoly and legitimate are difficult terms, right? We know, especially as Americans, that the United States government does not have a monopoly on force, right? There are more than 350 million weapons, guns, floating around in the United States, and there are fewer citizens than there are guns. And so, to sort of make this a necessity of the modern nation state, the monopoly on force is a very difficult thing to say about a place like even the United States, which is considered a pretty well established democracy. And then when you get to other places like Colombia during the FARC revolution, or what they call La Violencia, like 50 years of civil war, can Colombia ever be considered a state at that point, right? And states like Venezuela today, and a lot of Western African countries, which we've seen a lot of the rise of coups in states like Cote d'Ivoire. Um, and so we have a real problem with this word monopoly, and we'll sort of talk about that a little bit later. And there's also the problem of legitimate, right? Weber said it has to be a monopoly on legitimate force. What is legitimate force? This is not only a political question, but a philosophical question that may not have an answer, and there may never be an agreement on who's, say, on the right side of the Sudanese civil war, who's on the right side between Israel and Palestine, who is on the right side between the Turkish and the Kurds, who was on the right side when the British colonialized Ireland and the IRA was fighting back through terror. Who was on the right side during the American Revolution, right? And so the idea of legitimate is in the eye of the mind's beholder, right? Or the I got that wrong, I know, but it's in the eye of the beholder as to what legitimate force is. And even during, say, the George Floyd protests, where the cop basically murdered George Floyd in the street. There are still today arguments about whether that was legitimate use of police force. And so these are really difficult concepts we have to really sort of mull over in our mind and think about philosophically and also realistically. There are different definitions offered by Tilley and by Douglas North, who won the Nobel Prize, two very, very highly regarded social scientists. And a lot of them, they relax that idea of monopoly and legitimate, right? And so they basically say that a state just has to be able to use force to coerce its citizens to act in a particular way and to pay taxes to the state. And then we also have, which is sort of easier than deciding what is a state, it's deciding what is a failed state, right? That's a pretty easy concept for people to wrap their mind around. And these are the states where you can't even really call it a state, right? This is a territory wherein the the government per se cannot coerce citizens to follow the rules, right? Okay, so section 2 moves on to a brief history of a failed state in Somalia. I will let you guys do most of the mathematical and case study readings, and we'll just sort of touch on the concepts rather than the case study itself. Um, Case studies are interesting, but they're more about indicating how theories work on in the real world than they are at actually developing theories. And so I would say be careful if you get into comparative science about just using a simple case study to try to prove an idea. It's a lot easier to get variation when you have a whole lot of different samples in your set. Okay, so beyond that, the point here is that the concept of the state is very flexible and is on a spectrum. It is not Manichaean. It is not black and white. It is not, this is a state and this is not a state, right? There's a spectrum of stateness, sort of to conceptualize that way, right? And so we have this really, really top quality, well established states, right? So we have things like places like Finland, Norway, Sweden. They have incredibly high voting levels. They're really equal and egalitarian countries. They're very, very well established. There's very little civil discontent. They have high happiness levels among their societies, all of these different things, right? And then we can move on to sort of the second level of the top countries, the stable states, right? And so here I would put in like US. We have had a little bit more civil problems in our country recently. We have less control over our citizens, things of that sort. I would put Britain here. They're on a lot of the same footing as the United States, and so is France. A lot of the bigger countries have a little more problem controlling all of their territoriality and keeping everybody happy, right? So the smaller your state is, the easier that is. And then I would also put in a state like China, right? They're not a democracy in any sense of that word, and yet they are a powerful state. They have well developed territoriality and are even trying to play the expansionism and imperialism game. They have very well defined rules. They have incredibly powerful organizational and governmental structures in place. And so they are on the same level of stateness while they might not be a democracy. And then in sort of the bottom level of the say top third, right? I would put in states like Greece, Portugal, Italy, a lot of the southern European countries. They have a hard time putting together coalition governments. They have a lot of social discontent. They still have strong institutions and rules in place and stuff, but they're not nearly as strong as a state like Finland or Sweden. Okay, and then let's break it down into the middle third countries, right? And so at the top of this block, I would put countries like Brazil and India and South Africa, though I think all of them arguably are sliding. But they have a state in place. They generally have very little civil conflict or civil war. They have a pretty developed economy and are growing in influence on an international stage. And then in the sort of the middle, you would put the Eastern Bloc countries of Europe. So we're talking about Czechoslovakia, Romania, um, Ukraine, Turkey, Russia, even, right? Not really very powerful states, but they can use tools like repression, violence, and stuff to keep people in line. And then in the middling, at the very bottom, you sort of have North Africa, right? So we're talking about Tunisia, Egypt, Mauritania, and some other countries like that, Morocco. They're states, but they're not doing well, right? And we especially saw that after the Arab Spring in 2011, where all of those countries were basically overthrown all the way from northern Africa throughout, Palestine and Jordan and Lebanon and those sort of Middle Eastern, Mediterranean countries near Israel, where all of them were overthrown. They tried to implement democracy. It's been mostly a crippling failure, but they still have a state in some sense, right? They can provide some social services. They do have institutions, though they might not be well functioning, right? Okay, and then you have the really, really bad states, the bottom third, right? And a lot of these can be considered failed states or failing states. And so you've got Colombia, which is trying to crawl itself up after 50 years of civil war. They've had a civil war agreement in the last decade or so. There's still some violence. There's still real problems with their country, especially with Venezuelans and Hondurans flooding in after their own countries are falling apart. But Colombia is like pseudo state status, right? And so is a state like Venezuela. Pseudo state, right? A lot of people think of it as a failing state, but they still do have a pretty decent oil industry. They can still provide some basic social services, especially to their police and military, which are the main organizations that they're focused on keeping intact so that they control the rest of the population until they can fix things in the future, right? And at the very, very, very bottom, we've got the shit states, right? The ones that are just completely fallen apart. We've got a lot of sub-Saharan African countries, and we're seeing a lot of coups by either military juntas or by Islamist terrorists. And then you've also got states like Zimbabwe, right, in the 1990s when Robert Mugabe took over and expropriated all the land completely collapsed. You've got nations like Haiti, right, where they have repeated political assassinations. They've got gangs roaming the streets. There is no state, right? That is a truly failed state. If you look at a state like Sudan right now, which is or Eritrea or Ethiopia, which are all pretty much in the midst of a civil war, um, those are the places where states just simply cannot exist, and it is sort of a Hobbesian man versus man state of things, right? Okay. Um, we got a lot out of that from a discussion on Somalia, which had collapsed in the 90s and the 2000s. But I really wanted to just point out that there's this true spectrum of statehood rather than just this is a state and this is not. Okay, section three. The book basically is fashioned into two theoretical strands to be able to look at things from different perspectives as we go through the comparative politics literature. So, we will use first a contractarian view of the state, which is based on the word contract. This is the idea of the social contract between the citizen and other citizens, and between the citizen and the state. And then in the final section of this chapter, we will talk about the alternative view, which is called the predation view of the state, where the state is no better than an organized crime organization. And so you have to really come to terms with these two, the sort of Hobbesian, Lockean, Rousseau, contractarian nature of the state versus the very sort of skeptical, Jeffersonian fear of the state becoming a predator upon the citizens. And you have to sort of come to a nice balance about this, because you can't be, we can't live in anarchy, but we also can't give complete control to the state, like Hobbes said in Leviathan. So you've got to find a happy medium. So the first, section 3, is contractarian view of the state. A lot of this is based on, as I said, it comes from Aristotle and the Socrates Apology and Crito. It comes from Hobbes's Leviathan. It comes from John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, their sort of response to Leviathan. And then a lot of it also comes from the Madisonian perspective and the Hamiltonian perspective from at least the American founders, who were much more in line with, say, a strong national government versus Jefferson and his ilk, who were very skeptical of state power. So, if you're interested in any of this stuff, I just finished a course on political philosophy where we go through, I would at least say, listen to the first two sections on on Thomas Hobbes's Leviathan and on Jean-Jacques Rousseau's social contract. So basically, a lot of this contractarian view is based on these 4, 5, 6 guys. Um, Hobbes, to start things off, during the English Civil War and post 30 Years' War in England, I mean, not in England, in Europe, they'd seen just the devastation of civil war, the fight against the church, the fight between the Catholic Church and the Protestants, Calvinism, all kinds of stuff. An Enlightenment movement is going underway. And so Hobbes comes up with the Leviathan, the idea that, like, every man, I'm sure every one of you has heard the quote, life is short, brutish, nasty. Basically, he says that every man is in a violent struggle against every other man on earth, right? And that we have an incentive as humans to steal and abuse and manipulate, to empower ourselves, and to take advantage of anyone of which it is possible to take advantage of. And he says the only way to really get past this is through the Leviathan, that we have to build this contractual obligation between citizens to say that we do not want a violent, anarchic, civil war society. We want safety. And so, in lieu of your natural rights as a human being, you give up those natural rights for civil rights. And you give up your power to a state, and usually a monarchy, because that's pretty much all there was at the time, to a monarchy, and the monarchy will protect you under the promise that you will follow the rules and that you will pay taxes, basically, right? And if they call you to war, you'll go to war, these sorts of things, right? You have obligations to the state. But he also said that, like, the king is not beholden to the law. The king is above the law. The state is above the law. They make the law, and therefore they are greater than it. And that's where Locke and Rousseau really said, hold on, bullshit. Rein it in a little bit. They say that, yes, men can be problematic, even though Rousseau actually disagrees, and he thinks that the sort of communitarian, agrarian man is the perfect man, and that actually the state and society is what causes institutionalized violence. But the more important point, I think, is that he says the king or the state or whatever it is, of course, must be uh, a member of the community and beholden to the laws of the community, right? And that we need checks and balances to ensure that the human need for greed and aggregation are checked, and that the citizens be involved highly in making the laws, right? And so under Rousseau's contract, the individual citizens have a lot more power, and the king has a lot less power than under Hobbes. But they're kind of on the same page, right? We need to give up some of our natural rights for some civil rights. And then the the writer of the textbook goes through game theory. I would say, read the game theory. It's very important, but it's not going to be the focus of this class, right? And so they break down a Hobbesian perspective of game theory in a prisoner's dilemma box, basically, to show you how it works. But we're going to skip beyond all of that, and I'll let you read that, just like I'm going to let you read the case studies. Okay, so section 3.2 starts talking about the skepticism, right? Again, Hobbes theorizes that citizens would contract themselves to the state for protection, and that they would pay taxes and meet the normal obligations of a citizen. And then Rousseau and Locke were a lot more skeptical, and they suggest that we need a tripartite government, right? You have an executive and a legislative and a judicial. But then you also, according to sort of Weber and Rousseau, you need an administrative state. So kind of the fourth part of the tripartite, even though that doesn't make sense. Okay, so finally we'll move on to section 4. And instead of this like nice contractarian view of the state, Tilly in 1985 writes this really incredible book that wins him a lot of awards. And he digs through the history of Europe and the natural tendencies of the feudal lords and said that this predatory, sorry, I'm going to wipe off my screen, this predatory, manipulative, almost criminal organization is the best way to think about a state, right? And he says, rather than sort of conceptualizing the conflict between individuals like Rousseau and Locke and our sort of founders did, he says we need to move toward the difference between this sort of tension that is created between the citizen and the state, rather than thinking about citizen and citizen. And so he sort of conceptualizes the state, as an organized crime racket, right? It it uses its monopoly on violence to force you to follow rules and to extract resources from you so that it can build up its ability to create further violence against you. And so it's a really interesting argument. Um, but Tilly also says, look, if citizens can't be trustworthy, then why in the hell would leaders be? Like, why are we trusting them too? We have to be extremely careful about trusting any leader, given what happens to leaders when they're introduced to power. And so he offers this really brilliant, it's like an 800-page book, but he offers this really brilliant synopsis that basically what happened is post the fall of a lot of the control of the Catholic Church, what happened was you get these feudal lords, and they're controlling tiny little territories, right, all over Europe. And we're talking about 10, 20, 30,000 of these little lords, right? And they're often quite extortionary toward their what they call serfs, right? They're constantly trying to tax their serfs so that they can increase their wealth, but also increase the amount of land, the amount of produce that's coming off of the land, right? So you get these efficiencies of scale. And so as these efficiencies of scale start kicking up, what they learn is that they can use this violence against other lords in the region, not only to protect themselves from being overthrown, but also to increase their efficiencies of scale. And so they start using violence to take over land to ensure that they don't have any sort of challengers inside their own territory. And eventually, what happens is the bigger you grow, the bigger your economy of scale, right? Instead of having to build 10 what do you call them, pitchforks. Now we can build 10,000 swords at a far, far cheaper cost because we have a blacksmith and a blacksmith's assistant, and we have our own smithy, and we have all of these things that we can afford because we've aggregated all of this wealth, all of this power over these serfs. And so what happens is eventually they just start to overpower each other, and we get these giant territories that are demarcated generally by very easy demarcations like rivers, mountains. Obviously, with Britain, and it's an island, right? And so you kind of ran out of territory. But you get these sort of natural barriers, and this is sort of how the nation state, at least in Europe, happened. And he says there's four main principles that led to the aggregation of the state in Europe, and it was all accidental, right? These are incentives that humans had, and which accidentally led to the modern nation state. And the first is war making. And he says, quote, eliminating or neutralizing any rivals outside of your own territory in which they had clear and continuous priority as wielders of force, right? So the lord next door to you or all the contiguous lords to your land are a danger to you, and you have to either protect against them or kill them or steal their serfs, which happen quite often, raid their land, burn down their mills, whatever, so that you could keep power. Number two, state making. And he says this is about eliminating or neutralizing your rivals inside your own territory, right? And so you cannot have a challenger to the territory, to your own legitimate absolute power, right? Number three, protection, eliminating or neutralizing enemies of your client. And in this case, the client is the serf, right? And under Hobbes or Rousseau, the client is the citizen. And so neutralizing any enemies of your client, which is anyone who would take power from you inside your own territory or anyone trying to take your territory, you got to get rid of them, right? So it goes back to number one and number two. And then finally, extraction, right? Because you can't do any of this without extraction. And he says this is acquiring the means of carrying out the first three. It becomes vital. So you can either do this through taxation or theft or nationalization of assets. And so we'll talk about all of those later in this course. But two very, very different perspectives on the state. One, citizens are making a contract with the state to provide us protection. Two, the state was inevitable, and the state is an organized crime unit to take as much resources as you can without getting any revolutions. So, really interesting stuff, right? Okay, I'll see you for the next chapter. Thanks so much for being here, and have a great day.